Everybody, and welcome back to the VSI webinar series. Today we are turning the tables a little bit. Tom Sears from Kinsey Sears, who is regularly our facilitator, is the person in the hot seat today. Tom is going to be interviewed by Andy Duff, who, amongst other things, is one of our delegates on the VSI CEO program. And in particular, we're going to be looking at how you start to position yourself for an executive role in the world of sport. So we're looking forward to another 45 minutes of information and conversation. And before we get into the body of the topic, I'm going to hand you over to Tim, who will explain to those delegates on the panel how they can engage and ask questions. Tim, over to you.
Cheers, Tony. So if you're watching this on YouTube, it is futile to try to type in any questions or comments because we will not get them. They've been turned off. If you're lucky enough to be a participant in this or part of the audience, then just either use the Q&A or use the chat box at the bottom just to type in your messages, and we will ask those at the end of the interview. Or if it's really burning, it's relevant, then we will interrupt and ask directly. But without further ado, I can see that Tom is sweating. I'm not sure it's just down to the humidity. But Andy, it is over to you, my friend. Spotlight, revenge, as they say.
Thanks, Tim. So yeah, just a quick introduction to me, that those that don't know me, if you're watching on YouTube, my name's Andy Duff. I'm currently a delegate on the VSI CEO of a sports organisation programme. To mention it, an opportunity for all of us, especially if you're a panelist, to ask questions. So, I know this is a particular topic that we talk about offline a lot. So, really take that opportunity. You can interrupt or we'll do them at the end. So use this opportunity to ask questions. Tom, to kick things off, why don't you start by giving us a bit of a view of the man behind the interviewer for the last few weeks, and take us through your career so we know what you've done, and that'll be a good place to start.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So my career in sport industry started back in the late 90s when I joined the RFU at Twickenham. And I joined the communications department. Prior to that, I'd been a journalist working for agencies covering both news and sport, and always played a bit of rugby, and was really intrigued when the game started going professional. Post-95 World Cup really took off. So in 97, I joined the RFU, and within a couple of weeks, I was appointed to Clive Woodward's England management team as somebody who looked after the media and marketing requests, and spent a fantastic 2 years there, touring the world, watching fantastic rugby, learning a hell of a lot, really privileged position. And then the RFU went through a bit of a revamp. I was one of the many that were made redundant. I think about 50 or 60 people went, and I was very fortunate. Within a couple of days, I was offered a job at Northampton Saints Rugby Club by Keith Barwell, the owner at the time, as marketing and communications manager. And Northampton was, again, really trying to find its feet in the professional era, having been a very traditional rugby club for a long period of time. So it was a case of putting in new systems, new ways of working, realising what assets that the organisation had. And that was a great 2 years. Northampton won the Heineken Cup, beat Munster in the Twickenham final, had some amazing players, half the England squad. Ian McGeechan was coach when I first went, then John Steele, who was a really good guy to work with. And I had 2 really good years there. Post that, I changed sports and went into cricket and became commercial director at Worcestershire County Cricket Club. Beautiful grounds, lots to do. Again, cricket was probably a few years behind where it needed to be in the commercialisation, and had its unique challenges at Worcestershire, not least the flooding that they get on a regular basis. So 5 years there, we did some really innovative stuff. It was the time of 2020 coming in, and we did really well in terms of marketing 2020 locally and nationally as well. We brought in the first Chinese sponsors into cricket, a company called Haier, the big white goods company, and did some really interesting stuff there. After 5 years, I was looking for a move on and was appointed Chief Executive of Derbyshire Cricket, which was an interesting position. Derbyshire at the time were probably within about 6 months of becoming the first county cricket club to go into administration.
All right.
So it's real crisis management, real root and branch structural review, take it apart and put it back together again. And I think the first year I was appointed, we were due to lose around 200k. We managed to get that down to around 50 or 60k in year one, And then every year after that, we made a profit, which was some turnaround really, because we invested quite heavily in the facilities. We invested in the academy. We restructured the playing squad. There was a heavy reliance on Colpat players, overseas players. And we really wanted to re-engage with the local cricket family, if you like, and bring young players through our system and get people really buying into Derbyshire cricket again, which went really well. So I had 3 or 4 really good years there. And it had always been my ambition to work overseas. And I was approached by somebody if I'd be interested in looking at the chief exec's job at Canterbury Cricket down in New Zealand. So I flew over there, met the various people, met the chief exec at the time of New Zealand Cricket, a guy called Justin Vaughan. And Justin took me to the side and said, look, I don't think this is right for you, but we're doing a restructure. Would you be interested in coming over and working for us as the national governing body? So a couple of months later, I was offered the job as head of business development for New Zealand Cricket, which is a brilliant role, really given carte blanche to look at how the game was marketed, how it was commercialised. I was responsible for procurement, all the partnerships, and had a really good time there. It was probably one of the most enjoyable roles I've had in terms of working environment and what we achieved. And the people I was working with, the organisation was really well set up, really looked after its people, and it was a good, fun place to work. After a couple of years there, for family reasons, I was looking to get closer to home, and I was tapped on the shoulder by somebody at the ICC and asked if I'd be interested in moving to Kenya to look after Kenyan cricket as chief exec, who'd been through a pretty tumultuous time post 2003 when they reached the World Cup quarterfinals. There'd been a lot of upheaval, a lot of corruption, and the previous incumbent of the CEO's role was sacked for embezzlement, and they really needed somebody to go in and try and put some structure in place and try and address some of the issues that they had. So I'd always wanted to challenge myself overseas, and that was completely alien environment for me. And it was tough, but I probably learned more about myself in those 2 years in my professional career than I have anywhere else. And in the end, thoroughly enjoyable. And we achieved a lot. Unfortunately, things over there can go south pretty quickly, and it wasn't all sustainable. So left there after a couple of years when things started getting difficult security-wise, and decided to come back again closer to home, and was appointed Chief Executive of Connaught Rugby, working directly for the IRFU. Connaught was very much the 4th province, and we had ambitions of making it competitive, sustainable, and improving the way things were done. And again, it was a big turnaround job. Financially, it was pretty tough, underfunded, and some historical debt that needed addressing, and not run in the most professional way. So again, we pulled it apart, put it back together again. Again, invested heavily in the academy system and brought in local players as much as we could. And Connaught 2 or 3 years later won the Pro 12 title, which nobody thought they would. It was, funnily enough, it was the same year Leicester City won the Premiership, and you couldn't probably have had 2 longer shots at winning domestic titles. I perhaps should have had a double on it. But so after Connaught, I left there after just under 2 years, and came back to this country. Did various jobs at consultancy. I worked in the County Sports Partnership for a while. And then I was offered an opportunity to get into executive search. And it had been an area I'd always been interested in. Obviously recruited a lot of people over the years, both in terms of executive roles, high performance roles, also helped restructure management boards, committees, professional boards, that sort of thing. And there was a company called Peridot Partners who were looking to diversify their business and add a sports practice. So established a sports practice there, which I really enjoyed, and got to the point, well, why am I doing this for somebody else? So about 3 years ago now, we set up Kinsey Sears, and now we deal solely in the sports industry. We help organisations. They can be national governing bodies. We've worked with global federations, venues, professional clubs, charities, and so on. And we recruit board members. We restructure boards. We recruit C-level and director level staff. And we also do some high performance roles as well. And we work both domestically and internationally. So that's a whistle stop tour, Andy.
Yeah, very good. Tom, I'm going to take you back to a couple of sort of moves that you've made. I'm interested in what was the application process for taking some moves? You've talked once or twice about I was tapped on the shoulder. I heard about all this. So I'm interested, have you applied for adverts? Did the opportunity come through a network, or was it, a tap on the shoulder? And I'm interested in some of the significant moves you've made, whether you could just kind of share that process with us, and some of this, sort of how that worked for you.
Yeah, I often tell people that the hardest job to get in sport is the first one. And once you're in the industry, you'll find a lot of avenues open up for you. So, for example, I moved from Worcestershire to Derbyshire as my first chief exec's job. I knew that there was going to be a change there. And before the role was advertised, I got in touch with the chairman at Derbyshire, a guy called Trevor Barring, and said, look, this would be a role I'd be interested in. I think they interviewed 2 or 3 people, and went through the interview process like everybody else. But it's a case of really keeping your ears to the ground, building your network. Again, when I moved from New Zealand to Kenya, I'd worked with a lot of people at ICC, and again, through my network, found out that they were looking to appoint somebody. So it's making sure that you are really well connected, keep your ear to the ground, and keep having those conversations with people, because you will find opportunities arise.
Yeah, cool. I'm going to throw my first curveball if I can. It sounds like you've done some really interesting things, but what is the one job or the one organisation that you wish you joined? So you might not have been successful in the application, or you might have seen organisations thought, I really fancy that, but for some reason it didn't come off. It'd be interesting to see the one that got away. Yeah,
I've obviously interviewed for quite a few jobs over the years, and I probably found it hardest coming back from overseas into the domestic job market, to be perfectly honest. And there are a few roles. There's a couple in rugby that I was really keen on. One in Wales, one in English rugby, that I thought I had a really good shot at and didn't get. CEO roles, and you're always left a little bit disappointed. But you have to understand, and I've probably got a better perspective now, doing what I do now, that organisations are looking for something very specific a lot of the time, and it's no reflection on you as a candidate, but it's a reflection of what they need and the very specific skill set that they need at that time, the type of person in a lot of roles. So yeah, it's really disappointing not to get some of those positions, but you have to try and look at the bigger picture and use it as a positive experience, because any process that you go through, you should learn from.
Great. Well, shifting that then out to Kinsey Sears, firstly, what was the inspiration to set up your own business? But then also, it might be useful if you just take us through, if we start to segue onto today's topic, the process that you might go through from a client point of view or from an applicant point of view, to fill a vacancy.
Yeah, well, I've been a client and a candidate of most of the established search firms in the sports industry, both here and internationally as well. And to be honest, I've never found it a particularly great experience. Some better than others, but some particularly poor in the way things were handled. And I always thought it could be done better and a bit differently. And given the fact that I'd worked in sport for the best part of 25 years, I just thought there was nobody offering a service where they've got that intrinsic understanding what it's like to work in a sports organisation, to recruit these roles internally, to know the requirements, to know what works and what doesn't, and thought that we could offer something a bit different. So at Kinsey Sears, we use purely people that have worked in the sports industry. We don't use generalist researchers. We do all the research bespoke, which offers a more flexible and expert service, we think. And we're a bit more agile, so we'll bring in consultants for the specific role, dependent on the skills and experience that the candidate needs. So, for example, we've done director of catering roles at some really big sports venues, and I've brought somebody in specifically with that background. If it's legal roles or high performance roles, we have consultants, and that's the benefit of being in the industry for a long time, is that you've got that network and those relationships. You can bring people in that can really add value to the assignments, and that's the way we approach it. In terms of how it works, once we're appointed, the most important part of the process is briefing. And we invest an awful lot of time in getting to understand the organisation, the culture, the values, the people already there, what the issues are, what the challenges are, what the strategy is, the vision, what they're trying to achieve. And then again, I think because of that first-hand experience of being in those positions, we can then look to identify candidates that really fit the bill and that we think are going to work. And we always try and offer a diverse field of candidates, certainly at long list stage. one or two from left field perhaps that have got different backgrounds and transferable skills, or we think that can offer something slightly different. And it's a case of going through the process, understanding what the client wants, and then we do really in-depth research using a lot of tools like LinkedIn. We've got an organisation that we use, a professional search specialists in terms of research and finding those candidates. And we try and create a selection process that is going to really fit the bill for our client. So that could be a 3 or 4 stage process. It could involve presentation skills if that's relevant, but it always involves a lot of one-to-one conversations. And what I tell any candidate is that as soon as they make contact with our company, effectively they're being interviewed, because we start to analyse what sort of person they are, what their objectives are. Values and culture are really important, and how they might fit into an organisation. So if you do make contact, just be aware of the fact that first impressions do count.
Good. Well, that's your free plug over for Kinsey Sears now, Tom. I can ask you some other stuff now. I'm going to try and tease out, the topic of today, which I think is a kind of rich area, is how one positions themselves for an executive role in sports. So I'm going to try and ask you some questions around what are the building blocks. What tangible things can people do to give that public image? What to make yourself credible, but also kind of the tangible action. So to start with, it might be a question around how important do you think is creating a personal brand, sharing your values, and also are there any particular things that you should avoid or watch out for as you're trying to make that positioning statement, as it were?
Yeah, when you say the word brand, absolutely you need to build your profile. Brand can sound a little bit forced and artificial, and you can see that in some people in how they try and present themselves. My overriding quality would be, be genuine. Obviously, you need a good track record. You need the skills and experience that are suitable for the role, and be able to articulate those and demonstrate those through your CV, but also through your LinkedIn profile. Post articles, bit of thought leadership, bit of comment on relevant matters. And that's always interesting to see the activity that people do use LinkedIn for, see if they lead or if they just follow. And we do analyse that a lot. In terms of developing your skills and experience, it depends whether you're in the sports industry or transferring in. There's 2 different fields, really. One, if you're already in the sports industry, it's pretty easy for us to look at what you've done, talk to people, and network's extensive, and we can get a really good understanding of what you're like as an individual and what roles you played throughout your career. So we analyse that a lot. But it's down to the individual to really bring out and articulate the highlights of their career, and that's what we want to see, and make them relevant to the role that we're discussing. If you're looking to transfer into the sports industry, we need to find out what applicable skills you've got, how they relate to the role in question, but also in terms of what your understanding is of the sports industry. And we've had some really interesting examples of people who think they're moving into the job and understand it, but when the reality hits and the day-to-day life as a chief executive of a sports organisation comes to pass, then it's a very different reality. And some people, don't last too long. And you see that quite often, that people from outside of sport will secure a senior role within sport, but it's very different to what they're used to. Sports bodies and clubs tend to be big brands, but relatively small businesses, and the level of stakeholder engagement will be something they're not used to. The depth of feeling, particularly amongst supporters, fans, but also boards and committees, can be really quite strong. And again, not what they're used to, because people are so invested in sport, and that's why we all love it. But to translate that to your professional life is quite a different thing. So people need to be cognizant of that.
And are there any? You mentioned LinkedIn, you mentioned your CV. Are there any must-haves, any must-have tools that you think are really important to have in place? And again, are there any things that people should watch out for? It might be that their private social media accounts aren't right or anything. So the kind of must-have tools and the building blocks, and the things that also should be the watch-outs would be interesting to share.
Yeah, our first go-to is LinkedIn. So make sure your LinkedIn profile is really strong. It encapsulates what you've done, that it's accurate, because you'll be amazed how many people will have grammatical mistakes in there, or dates don't match, and things like that really matter. It's the simple stuff, but do it well. As I said, post articles, give comments. Don't be passive on LinkedIn. We're looking for people that can engage and can offer some really interesting insight, and that's really important. And far too many people will invite me to connect, and then that'll be the last you hear of them. Whereas if you're going to connect with somebody, make sure you have a conversation and try and set up a phone call, a Zoom call, or meet in person, because just collecting LinkedIn contacts isn't going to do any good at all. You've got to activate that. CV is always a must, and as I always tell people, you never have one CV. Your CV should be different for every job, but if you build a really strong foundation CV that you can tailor to the specific roles, that's a good exercise to do, and you should review it probably every year minimum. 6 to 9 months probably better. And on your CV, again, make sure it's laid out well. It encapsulates what you do. I always like to see a profile, but a factual profile. It's got to have your chronology of appointments, but it's really got to speak to the person who's reading it in terms of articulating your achievements, what you've been responsible for. So P&Ls that you've been responsible for, headcount of staff that you've looked after, your key achievements, growth, restructures, that sort of thing, in the roles you've played. The last thing I want to see on a CV is bland statements like I'm an inspirational leader or I've got these skills with nothing to back it up. Anybody can write what they think they are on a CV, but you have to be able to demonstrate the facts behind that. And we'll look really closely into that and examine it in great detail.
Interesting. And if I think of the VSI program, there are maybe 3 groups on the program. You've got maybe former athletes. You've got people already working in sports who are looking maybe for self-development or a promotion, and you've got people from business that are looking to transition into sport. Are there any particular functional backgrounds that you see are in higher demand, or maybe looking forward you see could be in higher demand in the future?
Yeah, it's very role specific and depending on where the client is and what they need, what their current situation is. But in broad trends, obviously digital is massive. An understanding of digital skills, the new platforms, how to reach mass audiences is really popular. Commercial backgrounds are always strong. What we've seen in the last probably 3 or 4 years is a real leaning towards appointing people from broadcast backgrounds. So you look at a lot of the top jobs, they've gone to people that have worked in broadcast industries. I'm not entirely convinced, because if you're chief executive of the FA or the ECB or one of our big national governing bodies, your broadcast revenue is probably about 80-90% of your revenue, but it's certainly not 80 or 90% of your job. And you need to be a lot more rounded than that. You need to be able to demonstrate that you can carry off all aspects of the job. And that's what we discuss with our clients is, well, what's the whole of the role that you're looking for rather than the key aspects, because sometimes it's very different.
Okay, and interesting. It talks about that skills and characteristics of an exec. Are there anything particular for sports? Is there anything with sports that make it unique to business in general?
As I said, I think having a deep understanding of what the sports industry means and how it works is really important. And that doesn't matter whether you're already in the industry or looking to transition into the industry. Having that intrinsic understanding of what you're getting yourself into for and the type of role you're applying for is really, really important. We tend to assess on about a dozen different characteristics. And those will be the obvious ones like communication, experience, skills, and so on. But then we delve a bit deeper into things like emotional intelligence, into adaptability, flexibility, resilience, qualities like that. And that's what we assess on. And we really go into a great deal of detail in terms of a person's background, but also in terms of how they'd approach the role. So if you're having an interview and you can't give a really strong answer to what your first 100 days looks like, then you're going to struggle. And interview processes are fairly straightforward. You'll know the type of questions that you can be asked and are likely to be asked, and you should be able to prepare for that. But equally, you should be able to think on your feet, and that adaptability and flexibility is crucial.
Interesting. So if you've got your positioning right, your LinkedIn profile, key question: where do people discover the opportunities? Is it adverts? Is it website? That it's interesting to where's the rich place to search for all of these vacancies that may or may not be kicking about?
Yeah, there's a number of sources. There's some really good websites. Things like UK Sport Jobs is a good source. Global Sports Jobs are very good. Will Lloyd runs a really good outfit there, and they post some great roles, and I've secured roles through them in the past myself. LinkedIn is a rich source now, so a lot of the jobs are advertised, but making connections and really building your network, I would say, is the most critical thing to do, and probably the hardest thing to do, but invest a bit of time into it. So that's meeting people, that's approaching organisations like Kinsey Sears. If we're approached by any candidate, we will always have a minimum a phone call conversation with them, so we can understand what they're about, what they're looking for, and delve a little bit deeper, because I can't put them forward as a candidate unless I've met them and spoken to them. So we invest a lot of time in doing that. So don't be afraid to approach agencies like ourselves and introduce yourself, and really be quite pushy in terms of you want a conversation, you want to meet people. We probably do it more than others, but it's well worth your time investing that time if you can, and be quite persistent. Because if you look at the sports industry, and in terms of the assignments that we do, I'd say probably only 30% are advertised. We do a lot of stuff direct. We do a lot of white label work, where we're looking at succession planning and talent pipelining, and looking at the leaders for the future. So we'll work with a number of organisations on a 3 to 5 year plan of what their executive team or board are going to look like. So it's important to make sure that you're meeting the right people and having the right conversations.
So it's kind of down to, or holding on the candidate to make sure it's managing that network of, relationships with you, but also all of your counterparts and competitors, a big network of opportunity. Yeah,
the key is to be proactive. You can't be passive, as I said about LinkedIn. Be really proactive on LinkedIn and approach people. Approach people direct at sports organisations. Draw up a hit list of the organisations that you'd really like to work for, and try and arrange to meet them, and find out what they're looking for. And it may not pay off in a role, but you'll have a better understanding. So there's no harm in approaching people direct and just having a conversation, because more often than not, people will be quite happy to give you 10-15 minutes of their time, and just to have that chat, and it'll be really rewarding for the people involved.
Yeah, great. And again, thinking about the different sports you've been involved in, are there any that you think are more open to fresh talent, more in need of fresh external talent, and also conversely, any that you think might be, if you've not participated and if you've not come from a background that are particularly locked out, whether maybe the model or the business model is difficult for people external to that sport to be part of?
Yeah, so I think the sports industry in general now is a lot more open to talent coming from outside the industry. As I said, there's different backgrounds that the industry will look to, in terms of FMCG is always strong, broadcast digital is always strong. So I think most sports are pretty receptive. And as I said, we always try and include at least 2 or 3 candidates in our long list that have come from different backgrounds, to give a different perspective to our clients and give them something to think about. In terms of sports that are harder to break into, I would say probably football is one of the hardest. They tend to be quite insular, quite myopic. They like people with a football background. And you see a lot of the same people cycle around various clubs and various organisations. So it's a difficult industry to break into. But as I say, once you get that first job, secure that first role, then different opportunities will open up, your network will grow. So what I would advise people who are looking to transition in or really get a foothold is, don't set your sights too high. Don't have glass ceilings where you've got non-negotiable positions. You might have to be a bit flexible, take a lower paid position or a lower graded role just to get your foot in the door, but it'd be worthwhile.
And Tom, some of your advice is that, do you think that is common for entry level positions? You're talking about your network and the amount of time you might meet people through the middle level through to senior level. Is this advice common across all the different levels?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's relevant to whatever position, in terms of building your network, being proactive, approaching organisations, approaching people. Regardless of the level of the role, if you're looking to leave university or college or whatever and get involved in the sports industry, you can't start too early, and make those direct approaches. Write letters to people, or letters a bit old-fashioned. Write emails to people, and get in touch, and you might write 100 emails and get 2 or 3 replies, but they'll be worth it.
Great. Tim, I've seen some questions bouncing in, but I can't actually see them on my screen. I don't know if you want to bring in some particular questions that the guys have had as we've gone in.
Sure. So Paul's asking, you touched on the requirement of having experience in sport, clearly. How much experience, specific experience, would a board expect before appointing a chief exec level?
Depends on the organisation, Tim, to be perfectly honest, and the situation they're in. So if they're looking for somebody to come in and do a real restructure, a real organisation, a bit of crisis management, then they'll probably look for somebody who's got a fair bit of industry experience and knowledge. If it's more a strategic role where they're looking to take the organisation in a different direction or building it in a slightly different way, if it could be capital projects so that they might need that experience, then they're perhaps more open. So it's difficult to put a number on it, but giving yourself that exposure, even if it's working as an NED for a smaller sports organisation, that exposure is always valuable.
Okay, so pretty much any experience within the sport at C-suite level is going to give you some sort of credibility that you'd be looking for to appoint at that particular level if they're looking for a leader, out-and-out leader. Brilliant. So Dean's asking, he'd like to know your expertise as an inside recruit expert of esports. So being more of a new age sport, is the skill set different from traditional sport, or is the desire requirement of the companies for new staff different?
Yeah, so we don't do a lot of esports stuff, but it's an area that is going to grow. I think you'll see certainly different skill sets and different demographics of candidates. Obviously, it appeals primarily to a much younger audience, the digital savvy generation that have grown up with that technology. So having that intrinsic understanding of how people engage across all platforms, being abreast of all the latest social platforms, and the way to really grow esports and monetize esports is going to be crucial. So I think you'll see less of the traditional leading sports executives moving to esports. I think you'll see a new generation of people that have grown up with it and come from different backgrounds. Some of the startup tech companies, some of the media companies, I think you'll see more and more of that sort of background in esports rather than the traditional sports exec as we know it moving across.
Okay, that's a good answer. I think you're right. There's a definitive new generation that's coming through. Mind-boggling that you can actually call it a sport, but hey, you know what? Each to their own, I guess. I think there's a piece, Andy, there that you've touched on a couple of times, and I wonder if it's the missing piece of the jigsaw that, or the burning question that no one's actually asking. So maybe if I go out on a limb, Tom, I think there's, you know, that bit of actually finding out where the jobs are, where the resources are. You've been tapped on the shoulder because people know who you are. You've got a good reputation. You've built that kind of rapport up. How do people that have not been in sport break down that barrier? How do you get past the gatekeepers? How do you establish yourself in that particular area so that you maybe can get tapped on the shoulder? Because clearly 30% is what's been advertised. So that gives us a good majority to go at. That's been, I don't know if you call it through nepotism, call it whatever you like, but it's a personal one-to-one touch. Can you expand on that and give that piece of the jigsaw away?
Yeah, so as I said, Tim, really it's about developing your network. You've obviously got to have a strong skill set. You've got to have the relevant experience that people are looking for. But as an individual, if you start making those connections, if you start having those conversations, another good way, as I said, is to start looking at NED roles. So if you can get some experience as a non-exec director, a trustee of a sports charity, you start to build that understanding, you start to get that exposure to the people in the industry, you start to get known. And it does take time, and it's not an easy thing to do, but you have to be proactive. And you'll see the candidates that are the most proactive and approach people and engage on as many levels as possible will be the ones that are successful.
So exposure within the industry. I think that's a key factor, isn't it? Of anybody that's, whether if you've got transferable skills from football to rugby to wherever, your leadership skills and your commercial acumen, if you wish, is all transferable. Sometimes is it a question of belief and confidence to be able to make that transition? Or, I mean, you come from a rugby background where clearly you've got a clear sight and passion for, into cricket, must have been kind of like, you know, twitchy backside time.
Yeah, I think once you're in sport, a lot of the relevant skills and experience is transferable between different codes. There are obviously nuances, but you start to develop that understanding of how sport works, how the cycles work, what commercial partners are looking for, how to engage with your stakeholder community, whether they're fans, supporters, or on a wider level. And you start to build that understanding, because working in the sports industry is very different to working in other industries. So it's easier if you're within sport and you've got that relevant experience. If you're transferring from outside, you've got to make relevant your skills and experience to the role that you've been appointed for. And that's easier with some backgrounds than others. But no candidate is going to have 100% of the boxes ticked. So it's about looking at the role and articulating how your experiences and skills and qualities are relevant to that role, and giving real good case studies. Because whether you're doing it in FMCG, broadcast, digital, or whatever, there will be things that you've done in terms of running an organization or leading a specific project that will be relevant to future employers in the sports industry.
Okay, so how do the stakeholders differ between an organization that's performing at a high level and the sporting industry? How do those stakeholders differ? Because you referred to that a couple of times.
Yeah, so it was interesting on the VSI course that I helped out with the earlier in the year. The guys did a stakeholder mapping exercise, and there's some fantastic work done. And Andy did one of the presentations, which was really impressive. And I think the delegates on the course were really quite shocked in terms of the level and the multitude of stakeholders that you're dealing with. So if you're chief executive of a sports organisation, and let's take Derbyshire County Cricket Club, where I was for a few years, you're not just running one business, you're probably running about a dozen different businesses. You're running a high performance program, you're running a commercial operation, you're running conference and events, you're running pubs effectively, you're running an events business. We ran a physio clinic. So you've got to have an understanding of how to run all those businesses. And developing those broad skills and that broad understanding is really key.
Okay.
I'm going to jump in on one question, I may. I'll tell you, as I've looked at various role profiles, and one of the things that's really surprised me is the hospitality industry. And I kind of thought of the world of sport, hadn't really massively thought about tickets, pubs, catering, all those pieces, and so that's a sort of an interesting skill set, whether people can transfer from the kind of hospitality industry, that's what it's called, hotel and catering, leisure industry, into sport. It was a bit of functional background that it passed me by completely until the last sort of 6 months or so.
Yeah, as I said, Andy, you're running a lot of different businesses, and the ability to sell tickets is primary to any sports organisation. But the ability to make sure your business is as near 365 business as possible is key. If you think about a sports club, whether it's cricket, maybe playing 40 days of cricket at home a year, football, rugby, you're playing maybe 20, 25 games at home a year. There's a lot of downtime when you're not putting on major events. So you've got to look to try and revenue generate in other areas. So having that understanding, having that ability to make the venue sweat is really important.
Great.
Tony, I've got a question that's come through about image. This is from Chad, who's a professional footballer. He says, I'm a pro footballer. This is my image. Are there any tips, insights, or can you introduce me to someone who will give me some knowledge on how I can create my brand aligned to the role of an executive, aligned to someone in the role of an executive position in sport?
Yeah, it's a difficult. We touched on this earlier, Tony, and I'm not a massive fan of this personal brand thing, because I think it's got to be genuine. And I think most people taking you through a recruitment process will see through a superficial brand. So you've got to have the intrinsic skills and qualities that a potential employer is looking for. But it's how you articulate what you've done previously is relevant to the role that is the key thing. So a great exercise that I encourage a lot of people to do is look at a number of job descriptions of the sort of roles you're interested in, and do a dummy application. Even if you're not in a position to apply, you don't have the requisite skills and experience, put down some bullet points of how you meet their criteria and some case studies of what you've done that are relevant. So, for example, for a professional footballer like Chad, they may be looking for at senior leadership level things like the ability to lead others, the ability to manage progressive change. And I'm sure any professional sportsman or sportswoman that's gone through a career in a high performance role will have been through periods like that where management coaches has changed. They've had successful years, they've had disappointing years, and all that experience is relevant, but it's how you articulate that and encapsulate that that brings it alive to the person potentially hiring you is really important.
Yeah, good insight. Appreciate that. Another question's come through from Paul Bullock. He says, do you see many organisations as part of their succession planning appointment assisting a CEO who can be moulded into the future role of a CEO? And what is the title of these positions?
Yeah, there's no set title, but I think there's more flexibility in C-level roles now. So I'll give you an example. We worked with a client last year on their leadership team restructure, and they found they were just lacking a bit of capacity to do some of the bits that fell between the portfolios. So they had a chief exec, commercial director, finance director, and an operations director. And they just needed an additional person to operate at that level to carry out some of the tasks, lead on projects, look after some of the stakeholder engagement and management. And it fell between the various stools. So it could be at various titles, but just look for those roles where they're looking to increase capacity rather than replace like for like, because they're the ones where you get more generous people who can add that real broad range of portfolio and skills and lead on some specific projects that are going to be relevant to that organization moving forward. In terms of how you position yourself for those roles and whether organizations are doing that internally, I think most organizations will always look internally at their leadership team to see if there's somebody stepping up, and some are groomed for the top spot. But I think if you did a percentage wise, it'd be relatively small. And it's usually external candidates, rightly or wrongly, that get appointed to the chief exec roles. There's not many people that step up successfully. Tend to find that really good operators within an organization quite often get overlooked because they're part of the furniture, and they may have to move organizations to make their next step up.
They're the questions we've got from there. Tony, have you got any more?
No. I'm just checking in the inbox here.
No, good. Andy, have you got any more? Do you think we've wrapped all through that?
The only one to conclude with, Tom, was to try and sort of maybe say, if you could give us your hit list, your kind of elevator speech of if you were external to sport, or even Chad's example from a performance background looking to move to an exec role, what are the 10 things, what are the 5 things, what are the kind of the tick list that said actually if you do these things you've positioned yourself really well?
Yeah, so number one would be to look at what experience and skills you've got, put those down in bullet point form, and how you can relate those to the roles that you're looking to secure in the future. From there, you start to build up your CV. As I said previously, your CV should be changed for every role because the emphasis is different. But put together a really strong CV and maybe get some advice on putting that together. Have an in-depth conversation with somebody, make sure they understand you and what you're all about so they can help you articulate that. Carry that across to your LinkedIn profile. But the crucial one is be active, don't be passive. So use tools like LinkedIn. Use direct approaches to go and have conversations with people in similar roles to the ones that you're looking to secure, in complementary roles to board members. Take any opportunity to engage that you can. And as I said, the sports industry is usually pretty welcoming. You can usually get a conversation with people if you're persistent. And it's just a case of putting yourself out there, making sure you understand what these roles constitute, what type of people that organizations are looking for, and start to mold yourself and build your experience, fill any gaps. Continual professional development is absolutely key. Take any opportunity to educate yourself. Do some pro bono work for a sports organization if you're in a position to do that. That's always useful. Particularly if you're transitioning from another industry into the sports industry, if you do a consultancy project free of charge for a smaller organization that perhaps can't afford those consultancy fees, great way of building some relevant experience. So they'd be the key ones I'd suggest.
Great, thank you very much. Tim.
Okay, so I've got one last question for you, and I think we've done really well on time, and we've got a couple of minutes to spare. So Tom, You've been on both sides of this, right? And you're now sat in the hot seat, so to speak. So the $1 million question is going to be, what's the one question that's not been asked so far that is going to be crucial for all the delegates that are on panelists now and on the VSI courses that are wanting to, or aspiring to be at C-suite level or senior positions within the sporting industry? What's the one question that's not been asked, in your opinion?
That people haven't asked today, Tim?
Yeah.
Or, God, that's a tough one. It's a difficult one. I'll turn it on its head slightly. And once you get to that position and you're in an interview stage, I always like to be asked by a candidate at the end of an interview, if somebody says to me, is there anything you feel like I haven't covered enough, or you've got any reservations, please let me know and you can address that. And that's absolutely key. And it demonstrates confidence in your own ability. It demonstrates that you're really looking to secure that role and looking to articulate yourself as well as possible. And it takes control of the conversation as well. And if you're looking for leadership, people who've got that confidence and that credibility and the ability to steer the conversation where they want to go, they're the ones that are going to stick in your memory.
Okay, great advice, I think. Andy, if you've not got any more, and Tony, it's time for pass it back over to you to wrap things up, my mate.
Andy, Tom, brilliant, really informative. Texts that are coming through from a number of the guys here that you've provided some insight, and just reading what I've put down, some tips with regards to how they can look at themselves moving forward. So as always, thanks for your time. Hope everyone's enjoyed it. Just going to leave you with one quote which came through from a friend of mine actually, which says, "Success never outperforms your level of self-development." So with that in mind, we'll call it a day. Thanks to everyone, and we'll see you again next week. Thanks, guys.
See you later. Cheers, guys.